Back when we first started the RGB Masterclass series, we didn't yet have a good switching solution. At the time, we were just swapping SCART cables. One of our most frequently asked questions since then has been, did you ever find a good SCART switcher? Well, thankfully, yes we have. But by now, we've gone so far down the rabbit hole that we've somehow found ways to use multiple switchers. And we've tested quite a few in the process, not just for RGB, but for component too. So, if you're looking for ideas on how to streamline your retro gaming setup, welcome to RGB308.
If you're like us and love to have all of your old consoles hooked up and ready to play at a moment's notice, then I'm sure you've already looked at various switchers and maybe even sunk some money into equipment that didn't give you the results you were hoping for. RGB and Component can produce the best analog images possible for retro consoles, but getting a good switcher setup that doesn't cause noticeable image degradation or cause sync issues can lead to a lot of frustration. Remember, with any analog switcher setup, you're trading at least a tiny if imperceptible amount of quality for the sake of convenience, and of course the benefit of lessened wear and tear on your ports and cables. Here are just a few general things to keep in mind before we take a look at specific units. Before you blame your switcher, RGB video can be especially sensitive to unclean power, so make sure your consoles are using good power supplies. Official is usually the best bet. You can also have issues with unclean power if your house is not properly grounded, and in some cases you might have to go so far as to look into power conditioners or voltage regulators. Some switchers, active switchers, require power. Mechanical or passive switchers do not. Active switchers are a solid-state design that use circuitry to switch inputs with no moving parts. They can also act as a sort of relay to allow extra length in your total cable run before you experience significant loss of signal quality. Passive switchers, instead of taking external electricity, use mechanical designs like spring-loaded buttons to switch inputs. But remember that a passive switch box and output cable add to your total transmission line, so it's critical to keep your run as short as possible when using this sort of switcher to avoid further quality loss. But on the other hand, it's kind of harder to screw up in making a passive switcher, while cheap active switchers are often poorly designed. You'll also run to options like automatic or manual switchers. Automatic may be the ideal in theory, but depending on your needs, you might run into issues without a manual override. And crucially, cables matter. Inexpensive cables tend to work fine if you're just going directly to an upscaler or CRT, but when you add a switch box to the mix, video noise and buzzing in the audio line can become much more apparent. The best way to avoid these issues are to use higher quality cables with thicker conductors and better shielding. Retro Console Accessories on eBay offers what she calls the Professional Multicore Coaxial Cabling Upgrade, which is a separate listing that can be ordered alongside any cable. We have bought a number of these cables and can confirm that they do an excellent job resolving audio and video issues when passing through switch boxes. Another option for minimizing audio buzz is to use a cable or adapter that breaks the audio line out of the SCART head, which may be convenient or inconvenient depending on your setup. Having good cables all the way down the chain is the ideal way to ensure best results, but needless to say, equipping every console with a multi-core cable is expensive. If nothing else, at least invest in an upgraded male-to-male SCART for your switcher's output to your upscaler or PVM adapter, or an upgraded SCART output that goes directly to the Framemeister's mini den. In most cases, having a beefier output cable should be enough. If you run into sync issues with certain consoles through certain switchers, we find that a Framemeister adapter cable with sync stripping functionality solves most sync problems. Image degradation tends to be less noticeable on CRTs than through upscalers, so you might be able to get away with less depending on your needs. Oh, and just because people always tell us retro console accessories isn't around anymore, she is. If the eBay shop appears to be closed, check back earlier the next day. It always seems to be shuttered for the day after some sales quota is met because they are made to order. UK website RetroGaming Cable sells a similar upgrade cable called Packapunch, but we have not had an opportunity to test that one for ourselves. A good deal of what we cover here is for the more common European wiring standard, SCART, or Euro-SCART as some people like to call it just to be extra clear. If you use the Japanese JP21 wiring standard, you may find less choice here, but some options do exist. Obviously, we can't look at every switcher, and I'm sure a lot of you have been very happy with some that we don't cover here. Keep in mind that SCART is by most standards outdated equipment and was never readily available in North America. So these are just a few examples of consumer electronics switchers, specialty switchers made just for retro gamers, and professional matrix switchers. It's a mix of stuff that may or may not be readily available at the time you watch this video, but if nothing else, hopefully it can give you some ideas and things to watch out for.
When we first started looking for SCART switchers, Bandridge was the name that everyone on the retro tech forums was talking about. Bandridge switchers were readily available and inexpensive. Since then, availability has been kind of hit and miss, but the Bandridge switchers are still worth a look if you can find one. First up is model SVB7725. This is a mechanical switcher with 5 inputs and 1 output. Input 1 can also support composite and S-video. Audio is carried over the SCART output, but you can optionally use stereo RCA output, which can be handy for sending audio to, say, a stereo system. When using a 5-foot SCART cable to the Bandridge and a 3-foot cable to the Framemeister, the result is actually super impressive. I don't see any loss of brightness or added video noise. However, this switch does have some quirks. Some systems may not work on all inputs, and more troubling is that when one system is turned on, voltage from the SCART cable can actually leak back into the consoles, turning on their LEDs while they're off. Thankfully, both problems have a very easy fix that anyone can do. After you get past these hard plastic screw covers, which I'm gonna be honest, they're an absolute pain to deal with, just remove the top and unscrew the boards inside. Then just pull the guts completely out of the case. On the underside of the green board, locate this trace right here. Take a utility blade and simply cut it. After I did this modification, I had no trouble with any console on any input, and there's no more voltage leaking. If you need more than 5 inputs, you can daisy chain 2 switchers together, but remember to keep the runs as short as possible. Now the Bandridge model SVB7735 appears very similar on the outside. This is a powered switcher with automatic switching, though it does have a manual override if you need it. This particular unit that was loaned to us by Adam Zay does not appear to have any weird input quirks like the passive Bandridge switcher, but we've heard that units from other production batches could have problems. When using the exact same cable lengths as with the passive Bandridge, the powered switcher exhibits a significant loss of brightness and sharpness. But you might not notice it unless you're looking at a side-by-side comparison or something. The good news is that there is no obvious video noise. We were also able to look at a mini Bandridge switcher, the SVB7733. This is an automatic powered switcher with 3 inputs. A bit more brightness is lost when compared to the larger automatic Bandridge, but otherwise results are fairly similar. At least brightness can be compensated for with scalers and TV settings. The Bandridge switchers are definitely worth a look if you can find them for a good price. As long as you use good cables in short runs and don't mind taking a knife to it, the passive Bandridge in particular offers really good results and lives up to its reputation.
Back in 2014, right around the time we released our first RGB episode, very limited quantities of a custom-designed 8-input automatic SCART switcher were being sold by its creator, Super G, on various retro tech forums. So I signed up for the waiting list and got to buy one. Later in 2016, he produced a larger run of a more advanced design with dual outputs sold through RetroRGB.com, and then moved to his own website, GRetroStuff, where he submits production runs based on a pre-order system, and he personally tests and ships out the final product from Michigan. I've been using a daisy chain configuration of 2 G-SCARTs for some time now. the older one, version 1.4, to one of the newer ones, version 3.2, with over 10 RGB systems connected, and a bit of room for more. I'm connected to my Framemeister and PVM at the same time, and as long as I don't turn on more than one system at once, I never have to even think about which G-SCART or what input I'm plugged into. I keep the whole thing hidden behind my setup and forget about it. It just works every time, no fuss. But before we get to no fuss, let's check the connections and options on the unit so you'll know how to use it for your setup. This is version 3.2, very similar to the current 3.4. The main benefit of this unit over the earlier G-SCART that I bought is that in addition to the 8 SCART inputs and 1 SCART output, there's also a D-sub output with a stereo audio jack. However, don't expect that this means you can play your games on a standard VGA monitor. Those will generally not support the 15 kHz video signal provided by most retro consoles. Instead, this port is intended for use with these BNC cables from Monoprice.com to connect to a PVM, Extron CrossPoint, or similar professional video interface. I use this port to connect directly to my PVM while simultaneously using the SCART output to connect to my Framemeister. There are also two little switches on the board. CV and HV chooses between C-Sync output and HV sync output for the D-sub connection. Choose the former if your equipment only uses one BNC cable for sync, or HV if it requires two cables for sync. The CS switch turns a built-in sync stripping function on or off. Sync stripping converts signals like sync on composite or sync on Luma into C-Sync for applications that need a dedicated sync signal. If you're having trouble with certain consoles displaying properly, try turning sync stripping on. If you get all of your consoles working correctly, then congrats! Tuck the G-SCART away and you'll probably never have to look at it again until you, gosh frickin' dang it, add another stupid console to your setup. And that is exactly why I bought a second G-SCART as soon as they became readily available, because even 8 inputs just isn't cutting it anymore. The older 1.4 version that I bought first was a lot cheaper, but it's also a much simpler device. It only has a single SCART output and external power is actually optional. Do note that sync on green for 480p RGB on PS2 does not send the signals needed for auto detect switching. So if you need sync on green for PS2, plug into port 8, the default input if no other signal is detected. Super G at one point made a JP21 version, but since SCART tends to be more commonly used, he published all information needed for someone else to manufacture their own if they need it. One of Super G's current projects at the time of this video is the new G-SCART Lite. Though with 8 inputs and 2 outputs, it's hardly light. It's just that the feature set has been reassessed and tweaked, and the end result is a device that is cheaper to manufacture. It still switches automatically, but instead of a D-sub output, it has dual SCART outputs, which should be equally as useful to most people. Super G sent Coury this early version of G-SCART Lite as a review unit equipped with the same sync stripping function as all other G-SCARTs. However, Super G is replacing this with a new method that he calls digital sync regeneration, which takes all sync, calculates the timings on Altera chip, and generates a new digital sync signal before converting it back to analog, a process that he says is even faster than sync stripping, and he expects this will solve all sync issues. All G-SCART Lites will support digital sync regeneration when he begins taking orders for mass-produced units. Alright, so let's see how all of these G-SCARTs stack up and if anything is lost in the process. The old 1.4 G-SCART and version 3.2 both lose just the teensiest bit of brightness compared to a direct connection. It's pretty much not even noticeable compared to the automatic Bandridges. But what surprised me was that the 3.2 switch actually loses just a hair of sharpness, while the older G-SCART doesn't seem to. I never noticed it until I did more in-depth tests for this episode, so it's not super severe, but what's going on here? According to Bob of RetroRGB, Super G started equipping G-SCARTs with a THS7374 amp, which creates a low-pass filter. A low-pass filter cleans up natural noise from the signal that analog displays just don't see, but digital displays and capture cards are more sensitive to it. So it is a good idea to have a low pass filter when you're ultimately going to a digital display, but the problem we're running into here is that the Framemeister is employing its own low pass filter, resulting in a slightly softer image. Having picture mode set is supposed to turn the low pass filter off, but some sort of filtering is still taking place. On the other hand, the OSSC has the option to override or disable the low pass filter. And we've heard that a switch to turn the low pass filter on or off is being considered for future gSCART revisions. The gSCART Lite is interesting then. It is not equipped with the THS7374 amp, and Coury's tests show no obvious brightness or sharpness loss compared to a direct connection. So even with its somewhat simpler board, the results are nearly perfect, but at a lower cost. And with features like digital sync regeneration coming to all future gSCART Lites, we can tell that Super G has put some serious time into making the Lite a very impressive device. Super G has also begun selling his G-Comp automatic component switch, which we'll get to in just a few minutes. Another interesting modern SCART switch project is the Hydra by Lotharek of Poland. He currently sells two versions, the regular Hydra with 8 SCART inputs and 1 SCART output, and the W Hydra, a completely over-the-top monster with a whopping 16 inputs.
16 inputs!
We were sent the 8 input unit for review. It's a bit longer than a gSCART, but much more narrow. You can power it simply with a micro USB cable. I have to admit, Hydra is simply a perfect name for a SCART switcher. The Hydra is also an automatic switcher, but it offers a semi-manual override feature, allowing it to seek for detectable signals to the left or right of the currently displayed input. A bit more brightness is lost compared to any version of the gSCART, but it's definitely not as dark as the automatic Bandridges. It also has something that Lotharek calls an HD filter, which we believe is some sort of toggleable low-pass filter. Very little sharpness is lost either way. The Hydra gave me a little trouble with my Genesis going to the Framemeister. I've been told that Genesis C-Sync is a little bit goofy, so I tried Sync on Composite and sure enough it provides a stable image. But do note that the Genesis C-Sync does seem to work via the Hydra for the open source scan converter or a PVM. The only other quirky situations that I ran into involved being unable to get a Sync on Luma cable for PlayStation consoles to work correctly with the Framemeister via the Hydra without using a sync stripper cable between the Hydra and the Framemeister, which is weird because the Framemeister normally takes it just fine. I had the same situation using 480p with the Dreamcast Toro box. Sync stripping was required before reaching the Framemeister. Thankfully, all other consoles that we tested seemed to work just as expected through the Hydra, and the OSSC had no issues with it at all. Early Hydra units may have a slight audio mistake that has since been revised. We experienced it only when trying to daisy chain to another switcher. And if you were thinking about adding a Hydra to an existing switcher setup, we did run into an issue with the Hydra messing with the gSCART when other inputs were active. So it might be smarter to choose gSCART or Hydra and stay within that family. If you need to add more inputs to a Hydra that you already own, Lotharek will be selling Hydra Head plugin expansion modules. After we worked through the issues, there was no system we couldn't get to work with the right cable setup. Once you get it going, the result is pretty impressive and it makes for a compelling gSCART alternative, especially if the 16 input version and expansion modules turn in good results too.
Everything we've looked at so far is for SCART. But what if you use JP21, the Japanese RGB standard? Well, it's not as commonly used, and equipment for it can be a little tougher to come by, but it provides equal results to SCART. Remember, either standard can be used with any region's consoles. The only thing that matters is what you plug the other end into. One reason that a lot of people choose JP21 is because you can use a Framemeister's default RGB adapter without buying a European SCART adapter instead. It's not surprising then that one of the better known JP21 switchers, the Selecti21 by Micomsoft, is sold by Solaris Japan, the chief exporter of the Framemeister. And hey, Joe from GameStack uses it, so that's gotta say something.
Yeah! Good game, Selecti! You see, when I select with something, I select with the Selecti21. This
unit was lent to us by My Life in Gaming viewer Matt Fowler. Thanks, Matt. The Selecty 21 only includes 3 inputs, which, let's be honest, isn't much. The layout of the box has 2 inputs on the back and 1 on the front for hot swapping. It's an unpowered switcher, so remember to use high quality cables and try to keep your cable run short. As long as you set it up like this, the quality is great. And you know, it should be, considering it tends to be a little bit pricey. The Selecty uses a DB15 port for video output. This means you'll be limited to custom cables, which are included with the switcher. One with an all-purpose JP21 connector, and the other for a direct connection to your Framemeister. Like your typical SCART cable, JP21 also passes audio through the connector. If you'd like to break out the audio from the Selecty, there's a 3.5mm output jack next to the DB15 output. For you arcade gamers out there, there's one special function of the Selecty 21 that might just interest you. This little switch on the front marked PCB/NTSC. In some cases, arcade games connected via a supergun can be a bit too bright. Toggling this switch will lower the brightness and balance your video levels. Despite obvious limitations due to the number of inputs, it's a pretty decent unit. As long as you don't mind paying a bit of a premium for it, the Selecty is certainly worth considering if you use JP21. So, is that it? Not even close. We haven't even talked about the other breed of RGB switcher that's completely different. This is a BNC matrix switcher, an Extron CrossPoint. They have a bit of a cult following, and after I bought one, I can see why. I found it to be so convenient that I somehow ended up with 2. Extron CrossPoints are a series of analog video matrix switchers with multiple inputs and outputs, most commonly something like 8 in and 4 out, but they can get completely ridiculous like 32 in and 32 out. These were widely used in professional applications, but have now fallen into disuse and have made their way to eBay for surprisingly cheap. It is not hard at all to get one for around $50 to $60 with shipping, or sometimes less. So what about using these BNC connectors with your retro consoles? Well, that's kind of the sticking point. You can find dedicated BNC cables for specific consoles online, but unfortunately they can get really expensive. Way more expensive than SCART cables. So either you justify the cost of the cables by the relatively low cost of the Extron unit, or you come up with another solution. You can use PVM SCART adapter cables, but that would be fairly expensive to equip every console with one of those too. Since I already had the G-SCART, I use it as my main RGB console switcher, and it outputs D-sub to BNC to an Extron CrossPoint. I also connect component cables via a component switcher using RCA to BNC adapters. Connecting multiple component systems directly to the Extron itself would of course be very cheap using these. When connecting a console directly to the Extron CrossPoint, whether using specialty BNC cables or SCART to BNC adapters, the picture quality seems to be pretty much faultless, with our tests showing absolutely no perceptible brightness or sharpness loss. If you can figure out a way to hook up all your consoles without breaking the bank, then you definitely can't go wrong. We had trouble getting things to work through the Extron to the Framemeister without a sync stripper adapter, but going to the OSSC or a PVM is pretty straightforward. The beauty of the Extron CrossPoint is that you aren't simply choosing one input to go to 8 outputs. Every output on a matrix switcher can be assigned to any input. So you can have RGB going to one monitor while component goes to another. I can route any signal wherever I need it to go, with different systems going to different TVs and capture devices. Just take my advice and label everything, because with this number of inputs and outputs, you can easily lose track of what's going where. One neat application for a matrix switcher is to send both RGB and component signals to a single input on your PVM. I just changed both the routing of the Extron and toggle the sync switch and color space setting of the PVM. If you don't want to do this, you might want to get an expansion card for your PVM to add another RGB input. I use the BKM129X. With that installed, I just send RGB to the built-in RGB input, and the component signal goes to the 129X. Then all I have to do is hit the option button on the monitor to switch between them. If you've decided that an Extron sounds exactly like something you need in your life, please note that connecting audio can be a bit of a pain. You see, these switches don't have standard RCA connectors for audio. Instead, it uses this input called Phoenix. Retro Console Accessories on eBay sells RCA to Phoenix connectors, which makes a world of difference when it comes to streamlining your audio setup. If you don't mind stripping your own cables, you can also just run the wires into the Phoenix connectors and tighten the screws. Most people will have no need for all these outputs, and I'll admit, it's a little bit ridiculous. But even if you have more modest connectivity needs, the low cost of an Extron CrossPoint makes it mighty tempting for any RGB setup, if you have the space and don't mind spending the extra money for cables. Finally, we should probably talk a little bit about component switchers. Thankfully, they're a lot less complicated. Component switchers mostly fall squarely into the realm of consumer electronics, and they don't have to account for weird sync types. Sync is always carried with the luma of a standard YPbPr signal. The overall simplicity makes it easier to get away with less rigorous design standards. For example, the Monoprice Component Switcher is likely one of the most common and readily available out there. It's a powered switcher that takes 4 inputs and has 1 output, and it's super inexpensive and readily available. The HD Retrovision guys, who made those SNES and Genesis component cables, tell us that the Monoprice switcher has some design flaws. It seems to exhibit only a minor shift in color that hardly anyone would notice, but nonetheless it provides pretty okay results considering the cost. For years, Tri and I have been using a powered component switcher by Impact Acoustics. It's super handy because it has an impressive 6 inputs and 2 outputs, enough for a PS2, GameCube, Xbox, Wii, PSP, and something else. Unfortunately, some brightness is lost, but sharpness appears to be preserved, and no additional noise seems to be added. But you know, just like with the Bandridge and Selecti 21, if you use good cables and keep runs short, a bare-bones mechanical switcher like the one made by game accessory manufacturer Pelican can actually provide great results. It only has 3 component inputs, but can you tell the difference? I sure can't. You know, switchers like this pop up at thrift stores all the time, so next time you see one, it might be worth giving one a chance. But the most exciting thing in the world of component switching right now is Super G's G-Comp switch. This supports 4 inputs, 1 output, and fully automatic switching. Just like with the G-SCART switchers, you can plug everything in and forget it. It just works. Tri just bought one from Super G's second batch and reports no visible loss of brightness or sharpness, and no apparent noise. It might cost a lot for only 4 inputs, but it's definitely a purchase for convenience more than anything.
Well, that pretty much sums up the switchers that we've been able to try out over the past few years. There's a good chance we missed your favorite switcher, but we can't cover everything. The biggest surprise to us is that mechanical switchers, while a bit more limiting, can actually be not bad at all if you use them right, and that many powered switchers lose more brightness and sharpness than you might expect. But that might not even matter in a lot of cases. And it's really cool to see people like Super G and Lotharek making their own solutions specifically made for retro gamers, and we hope to see even more options in the years to come. The lesson here is that switching analog video signals via circuitry is not at all a trivial matter, but how much you need to pay really depends on what you're doing. If you're just connecting to a CRT, it's easier to get away with a little bit more signal variation. If you're trying to make high quality recordings of retro console games, then you might need to worry a bit more about what's lost along the way. Every solution in this episode should be good for someone. It's all about what fits within your setup and your budget.